So this is the edge case that I ended up realizing I had. When you render a follow button, there's actually three possible states. One is I'm following this person. Another is I'm not following this person. And the third is it's me. I should never render a follow button for myself. If I'm viewing my own profile, if I have a follow button there, that's a mistake. That just doesn't make any sense. So I asked myself the question, is it possible to rule that out at compile time, to make it actually impossible to render a follow button for myself? It turns out, yeah, it is possible, and here's how. So let's say we have a type called author, and author is a non-opaque type with three variants. So it's got is following, which means I am following this author. It's got is not following, which means I'm not following this author, and is viewer. Viewer is the term that I've used here to refer to currently logged in user, just because it's one word instead of three. And essentially this is the one that says it's me. Now notice that each of these has different types of data that they're storing along with the variant. So is following stores a followed author. Followed author is an opaque type. It holds on to username and profile. Those are the two pieces of information we have about every author. So followed author has one variant, which is also called followed author. This is a pretty common pattern if you have a single variant to just give the variant the same name as the type itself. It's a little bit confusing the first time you see it, but over time you realize that, well, there isn't really a better name for this thing if there's only one variant. So people end up typically using the same name as the type for the one variant when you're doing that. So we have followed author, which has username and profile, and unfollowed author, which has username and profile. Now if I go up at the top here, we can see that sure enough, I am in fact exposing the variants for author. We'll talk about why momentarily, but not for followed author and not for unfollowed author. So the only way that I can actually get one of these followed authors or unfollowed authors is by using functions like the ones down here. I can do things like I can follow someone, which takes me from unfollowed author to followed author. I can unfollow someone, which takes me from followed author to unfollowed author. I can request a follow, which is to say, go tell the server, hey, I want to follow this person or I want to unfollow this person. And in either case, I'm always being very explicit about whether I am currently or following or not that person. Another thing to note is that this is a nice handy trick when you have a single variant custom type, is you can actually destructure it in line. So this is effectively the same thing as if I had instead said, named this unfollowed author, and then I'd said down here, case unfollowed author of, and then I just had the one case down in here. So instead of doing that, it's a lot more concise to just do it in line. And Elm allows you to do that because it's essentially an inline pattern match where there's only one pattern. And since with a single variant custom type, there's only one possible pattern, the compiler accepts this and knows what to do with it. Okay. So now that I've got my followed author and unfollowed author, which are opaque, how do I actually obtain one from the get-go? Well, if you notice, we can request to follow and unfollow people, but the only way we can actually get an author in the first place is to get one from one of these HTTP requests. Like I can do an HTTP request that will give me an author back, but once I have one, all I can do is destructure it into one of these three possibilities. Either I'm following them, in which case I get a followed author, I'm not following, in which case I get an unfollowed author, or it's me and I get sort of myself back. Now the fact that this is not opaque doesn't really harm me in this case because how could I possibly construct one of these authors? Well, there are three variants here. One of them contains an opaque type, so I need to already have a followed author in order to construct one of those. The other one's also opaque, so I need an unfollowed author to be able to construct one of those. And the final one is me, which means I can construct an author that is me if I am me, which, okay, fine, I can do that, but I'm not really getting any new information there. I'm not really breaking any invariants. I'm able to just say, this is an author that is myself, which is information that I already had. So the fact that we're exposing these variants isn't really costing us any guarantees. It's got the same set of guarantees as if we did not expose those variants. But what exposing them does turns out to be pretty cool. So let's take a look at the profile page. So here's what goes on the profile page. When I want to render a follow or unfollow button, I do a case expression on my author, and I've got these three branches. One is, it's me. I say, well, we can't follow ourselves, so here I render nothing. If I am following this person, then I render an unfollow button. And if I am not following this person, then I render a follow button. Now what's cool about this is that I can't actually write this code without writing the case expression. I can't call unfollow button without having a followed author, and I can't call follow button without having an unfollowed author. Because each of those requires passing the other one. Follow button requires taking an unfollowed author. Unfollow button requires taking a followed author. And the only way I can obtain one of those if I've got an article is to actually enumerate all three of these cases. I have to write a case expression. I have to handle all three types. So because of the way we've set up the variants and which of these types are opaque, it ends up being the case that the only way to render a follow and unfollow button is to render a follow button for someone I'm not following, to render an unfollow button for someone that I am following, and I can't render either of them if it's me. So we've successfully turned this edge case from something where I have to remember to do it all the time, or I have to document to do it and hope that the person who joins the company 12 months from now and is their first week on the job and is going to render a follow button, that they remember that, into something where you kind of can't mess it up, or at least you can't mess up the part where you need to know how to handle it properly. This isn't to say that you can't make other mistakes. I could still render something incomprehensible here, or I could choose not to render an unfollow button here. But at the very least, the edge case of forgetting to handle this is no longer really possible to ignore. Questions on that? Yeah?
So to that point about kind of like sharing knowledge, when you get a code review, if you see somebody expose something new, would that like be a red flag? Like maybe they didn't get it and they kind of dove into that opaque type and...
For sure, yeah. So like if somebody makes a pull request and they do this, yeah, that's usually a red flag. If you're going from unexposed constructors to exposed constructors, probably there should be a name change going along with that, because it probably means you're doing something fundamentally different than what you're doing before. Yeah, I would definitely consider that a pretty... It's essentially the equivalent of if you're working in like Ruby or Java and someone takes all the stuff that was in private and just moves it to public. Like, it's like, wait. Why are we doing this? This seems like a bad idea.
In the case statement, you were returning HTML and then just returning an empty text node, looks like.
Yeah.
That's pretty common.
Oh yeah, that's so another way you can do it. This is a shorthand I like to use for essentially saying I don't want to return any virtual DOM node because an empty text node is essentially invisible in the DOM to the end user. Another way you can do it is you could have this return a maybe, or you could have it return a list of HTML and then concatenate them on other things and return empty list there. But often enough, I just tend to go with this. Any of those three ways work. We're done with to the code. All right, so let's review. We started off by talking about module boundaries, the idea of being able to selectively expose our variants such that we don't expose everything by default, but rather we choose to only expose variants when it sort of makes sense. We talked about the idea of opaque types, which is to say types where the implementation details are hidden, the variants are not exposed, or maybe it's not even a custom type under the hood at all in the case of some of the things that are built into the core libraries. We talked about the idea of validated data. We talked about the email type, where we could guarantee that the email had at least been validated if you were to obtain one of those values. And then we showed how to do that with a wrapper called valid, which the only way to obtain one of those was to run it through a validation function. And it would guarantee that whatever type you had been run through a validator of some sort. And finally, we talked about when not to go opaque. We saw the example of the author, where we had three variants, which it was totally fine to expose based on the way that we were ending up using it. It wasn't actually breaking any guarantees, and it did require that the end user needed to handle all three of those cases. And in fact, the fact that you had the full pattern matching abilities without losing any guarantees turned out to be beneficial.